policy or event. We're going to compare the results of that policy or event with not what was before, but with a hypothetical, with what would have been in the absence of that policy. So we're comparing what today would have been like without the policy. This is a hypothetical. It never existed. We're going to compare that with what the world is actually like. The economic history example that made this methodology famous is the work by Robert Solow, work for which he received a Nobel Prize in economics for his work in economic history. And Bob Solow was looking at the question of whether or not a railroad was essential to economic growth. Because in the 1960s, amongst development economists, for instance, there was the presumption that in the United States, the railroad had preceded the strong pattern of economic growth in this country, and therefore it seemed that a railroad was a necessary precondition to economic growth, and that for an economy to grow, an economy needed a railroad. And therefore, development economists, reasoning by analogy, took that lesson from history and plopped it down on top of third world countries and said, oh, you're very, very poor. What you need is a railroad. And if you build a railroad, then you will become a rich country. What Bob Fogel did was he said, maybe it's not the railroad. Maybe it's a transportation network. What we need to do is not compare rates of economic growth before the railroad with rates of economic growth after the railroad. That would be are they green up there? No, it's yellow. Totally different. That would be this first line, comparing the world before the railroad with the world after the railroad, which is what we don't want to do. What Bob Fogel said was, what we need to do is compare the way the world would have been if they had not built the railroads with the way the world is having built the railroads. So then the task is to properly define the counterfactual, because this hypothetical here is what we call the counterfactual. So the outcome that uses facts that are counter to what actually happened, or different than what actually happened. And Bob Fogel said that the proper counterfactual here is what would have happened in the United States had we not constructed the railroads. Well, had we not constructed the railroads, there would have been some other transportation network that was put into place, because we had a transportation network, which was the canal system and the river system. And so he took maps of the United States and looked at both the rivers, which rivers were navigable, and where canals could reasonably have been built, and looked to see what would the patterns of trade have been like if instead of a railroad system we had had a canal system. The question he was asking was it the railroad that mattered, or was it the transportation network that mattered? If it was a transportation network, just generally, and not a railroad in particular, then the policy prescription for the third world would have been, you need a transportation network, not you need a railroad. That's using the counterfactual. So there the counterfactual is what would the world have been in the absence of the railroad, and properly specifying that counterfactual and comparing that with the way the world actually was. Okay. All right. Next. Framework. The framework we're going to use in this course is primarily models of economic growth and development. So to keep like all the pieces that we're doing sort of straight in your head, I think that this is the framework that you want. This is illustrated in the article by Gould and Ruffin. It was also assigned for today, and we'll get started on this framework today, and then probably finish it up on Thursday. For some, you guys have a variety of backgrounds. How many people in the course? How many people in the room? Your only econ class is econ 1. A few. Okay. So there's a few people in the room who've only had econ 1. How many people in the room have taken 100B? For those of you who took 100B with Steve Wood, did you do growth models? Yes? Okay. I mean, I know you did if you took it with me. Okay. So for some of you, this is review, and for some of you, this is brand new. So that's the way this is going to be the whole semester, right? There's going to be some, because you all have taken a variety of different background courses, some of what we're going to do in terms of the economics will be review, some of it will be new. That's why it's going to be particularly valuable, especially for those of you who've only had econ 1, to get yourself into study groups. And pair up with other people and make sure in your study group are people who also had courses beyond econ 1 to help you get up to speed. Those of you who've only had econ 1, let me ask another question. People who had 100B, if I give you a quiz right now on the growth model, how well would you do? Really well? Really poorly? Yeah. Okay. So people who've only had econ 1, don't feel too bad, because their answer was, oh. All right, so let's see what we can do with this. Economic growth. When we study economic history, we're taking a long view. So remember, in this part of economics, when we talk about long run, we're talking about generation to generation, decade to decade, so long periods of time. In economics, you may remember we have two different definitions of short run and long run. So we have the micro definition of short run and long run, and in microeconomics, our definitions of short run and long run have to do with whether or not you can change the amount of capital that's being used, the number of machines and buildings. We don't want that definition, so just let that definition fall off of your brain for this class. You may need it for some other class. For this class, the definition of long run that we're using is the historical definition of long run, which is basically decade to decade or generation to generation. So generation, 20, 25 or so years. Generations are getting longer today, but typically we think of about 20 or so years as being the length of a generation. So when we talk about economic growth, we're talking about those long-run trends. We're not talking about the change in GDP between 2009 and 2007. That's very short run. We're talking about changes over a couple of decades or a couple of generations. We're going to measure that by looking at real GDP per capita or living standards. In the back row, do you guys have a question? Back row, do you all have a question? I'm happy to take questions. No? Okay, cool. All right. I don't know if I said that, but I'm happy to take questions, because it's a really boring class if I don't take questions. So, all right. Economic growth. Increases in real GDP per capita. So we're going to divide this by the number of people so that we're not just measuring the effect of increasing population, but instead we're capturing increases in living standards. So when we talk about economic growth, we're really focused on increases in living standards. The other framework that we have is economic development. And by economic development, we mean the development of the infrastructure that we use for producing goods and services. By infrastructure, we mean things like roads and bridges and highways and trains. We mean also the communications network. We mean the property rights system. We mean the judicial system. All of that, which is part of the, if you will, the framework or the infrastructure in which economic activity takes place. Let me show you some numbers, and we'll come back and look at some models. So from your handout for today, Table 1. Table 1 looks at economic growth rates. The numbers above the line are from the Gould and Ruffin article. The numbers below the line are data that I filled in with a consistent data source. And if you look at, first off, look down the column. And what it's showing you first is that the economic growth rate, so this is a rise in real GDP per capita, which is a measure of living standards, that the rate at which real GDP per capita increased was about 1.5% in 1820 to 1870, and then jumped to 1.9% for 1870 to 1989, which is when they wrote the article that's in, or when they gathered the data, I guess, for the article in your reader. So that we've had an increase in the rate of growth basically after the Civil War. The other thing to note looking down the column is that there was the heyday of rapid economic growth. So the data that Gould and Ruffin used, they had a 2.2% rate of growth. I gathered some data yesterday that are consistent with each other, and you see a similar high rate of growth, 2.5% rate of growth of real GDP per capita from 1950 to 1973. So we've got this period there where we've got very rapid growth in living standards immediately after World War II. And then more recently, still looking down the column, in the article they give you 1973 to 1989. I went ahead and also gave you 1989 to 2007. And you can see the slowdown in the rate of growth. So whereas living standards were growing about 2.5% per year immediately after World War II, starting about the 3/4 of the way through the century, that rate of growth declined, and then it declines again around 1990 or so. So we're living in an economy that had a heyday here in the post-World War II period. A lot of people whose history begins in 1946, and this would include most macroeconomists, a lot of people whose history begins in 1946 will look back at this 1950 to 1973 period and say, why can't we get back to the way things used to be? Well, the 1950 to 1973 period, when you look at it from the perspective of 2 centuries, it's not the way things used to be. We didn't have over 2% growth for a century or more leading into World War II. We had below 2% growth in living standards for a century or more leading into World War II. And we had this generation-long, 1950 to 1973, about a generation, we had this generation-long period of very rapid economic growth. It's more like it was a bubble in the economic growth rate, not like it was a trend that we could return to. If you start your graphs in 1946, it's going to look like a trend we ought to return to. If you start your graphs in 1820, it's going to look more like a bubble. History. Sam. Yeah. So the question is, are we going to use real GDP per capita as our measure of living standards? By and large, yes, even though it's a flawed measure, right? So real GDP per capita doesn't take into account economic bads, pollution, crime, life length, and so on. But it gives us at least a starting point for looking at one particular kind of question, which is the material standard of living. So, all right. Now, the other thing to look at with this table is to look across the rows. So the other thing that we see is that in the 19th century, the United States growth was greater than the growth of the 14 other countries that Gould and Ruffin look at in their article, and I don't remember what those 14 countries are, but you can look it up when you read the article. And then, in the second half of the 20th century, that turned around, so that the rates of growth of the other 14 countries that they look at was greater. These are averages over, so yes, that's the average for the 14 countries, yeah. So it's the annual average for the 14 countries. And I don't know what the 14 countries are, but imagine they're OECD-type countries. Okay. So this is one measure, and it gives us some questions. Right in the back, Ian. Where am I? So if I had 1870 to 1950, yeah. Yes, so if I had 1870 to 1950, this 1.9 number would be greater. Yeah, and that gap in growth would probably be greater. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so this is one set of data that we can look at to see, oh, there have been changes over time in the rates of economic growth. There are differences between the United States and other countries, with faster economic growth here before World War II and slower economic growth in the United States after World War II. Another way of looking at another measure, similar measure, of living standards is to look at GNP per capita. For the United States, there's not a lot of difference between GDP and GNP. GDP measures the amount of production that takes place within the geographic borders of the United States. GNP, gross national product, measures the amount of production that takes place in American-owned businesses, whether they're located in the United States or in other countries. There's not a lot of difference between GNP and GDP for the United States. There is a lot of difference between GNP and GDP for countries that have a lot of multinationals housed in those countries. So if you look at, for instance, a lot of Latin American countries, you'll see a big difference between GDP and GNP in the periods when there's a lot of multinational activity taking place in those countries. And again, you can see a similar thing. Now, this is annual growth from the previous date. So here, for instance, this 3.4% is the annual rate of growth between 1929 and 1945. You might think that's wrong because it includes 1929 to 1933, which was the Great Depression, but it also includes the recovery from the Great Depression, where, as you'll see later in the course, we had pretty rapid economic growth, and it includes World War II, where we had phenomenally fast economic growth. And when we look at these data again, we can see that here I want to just look at sort of the early period and the later period where it's less of a pattern. We can see that there looks to be an increase in the rates of economic growth. First, that the rates of economic growth are increasing from the 1775 to 1840 period through the mid-1800s, so that economic growth is speeding up. This 0.5% is 1710 to 1775. And that, again, we see we're going to have this spurt in growth here. This is from the war. The numbers that I had in the previous, because I broke the table at a different year for Table 1 than it's breaking at Table 2, we don't see that phenomenal growth from the 1950 to 1973 period, simply because this has clumped 1960 to 2001 clump. But all of this is saying, look, we've got some growth patterns here to explain. We've got growth in the pre-Civil War period, which seems to be picking up pace over time. We've got a spurt of growth, 1950 to 1973. What are the stories that we can use to understand what determines those rates of growth in the American economy? One model that we can use to understand rates of economic growth is the Production Possibilities Frontier Model. So the Production Possibilities Frontier Model, or the PPF, when we do the Production Possibilities Frontier Model, we're looking at the combinations of output that can be produced in some time period with the available resources. When I graph the PPF, what am I going to put on the axes? Raise your hand, somebody tell me. What am I going to put on the axes on the PPF? Who remembers? What's your name? Alex. Good. I'm going to put outputs. So I could put good 1 and good 2. I could put guns and butter. I could put consumption goods and investment goods. I could put investment goods and all other goods. So let me use guns and butter. Guns and butter means military production and non-military production. So the goods and services that we produce in this economy that are for the military production, and the goods and services we produce in this economy that are not for military. When I draw my PPF, what's it going to look like? Show me with your arms. What's it going to look like? Good. All right. I'm showing you with my arm because I can't help myself. So it's downward sloping, but it's not a straight line. So we're going to go nonlinear, bowed out from the origin curve. We're going to label it PPF for Production Possibilities Frontier. That's what it's for. Why does it slope down? Why does the PPF have a downward slope instead of an upward slope? Way up there. Good. Opportunity cost of production. So another way of saying opportunity costs is there's trade-offs, that we have to make trade-offs. And there are opportunity costs, and we do have to make trade-offs because the amount of resources that we have the amount of resources we have are finite or limited, right? So we have a downward sloping production possibilities frontier because the fact that resources are limited or finite means that we have to make choices. There are trade-offs. That is to say, there is an opportunity cost. Anytime we use a resource to produce guns, we can't use that same resource to produce butter. We have to make a choice. Downward slope. Why is it nonlinear? Why isn't it a straight line? Why does it bow out? Why is it nonlinear? Something else. Give it a stab. It was a funny word. It is the law of increasing opportunity costs. Ding, 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 ding. Good. The law of increasing opportunity costs is how we summarize it, what's the characteristic of our resources that creates the law of increasing opportunity cost? Bingo. Resources are not ubiquitous. Resources are not everywhere the same. So an acre of land that's good for growing wheat is probably not good for growing rice. An acre of land that's good for growing cactus is probably not good for growing corn. A person who's good at teaching economics, probably not good at fixing cars. Resources are not ubiquitous. They're not everywhere the same. You can't just pick up one person and randomly put them down in a situation and have them be as productive as any other person. Resources are not everywhere the same. When we use the production possibilities frontier to talk about economic growth, when we talk about economic growth, we're talking about the factors that make the production possibilities frontier shift out and give us a whole new production possibilities frontier, such as this, PPF2, which is shifted out. There are, in general, two possible sources of growth. What are they? Somebody give me one. Patrick. Technology. And technology is a subset of something. So technology more broadly would be productivity. Good. So technology or increases in productivity. That's one thing that can take and shift out the production possibilities frontier. What's the other thing that can shift out the production possibilities frontier in the top? Trade doesn't shift the PPF. We'll come back to trade. Hold that answer for Thursday, because I'm going to ask that question on Thursday. An increase, good. An increase in the quantity of the resources. So if there's more labor or more land or more capital, so we have more of the resources, more of the inputs, that's another thing that can increase the production possibilities frontier. So when we look at those numbers that we had in tables 1 and 2, we're going to ask about whether these rates of growth, how much of those rates of growth are due to increases in the quantity of resources, and how much of those increases in growth are due to increases in productivity. Let me skip ahead to a slide. Oh, it's all right there. I was going to ask you to tell me what they were. Phooey. Well, I'll let you read it. When we start talking about the things that increase productivity, we're going to talk about most of these things. So education. Education is one of the things that can increase productivity, make our resources more productive. Research and development is something that can make our resources more productive, increasing economic growth. Developing financial institutions. We're going to spend several days talking about financial institutions. Financial institutions channel the funds from the savers to the investors. Without properly functioning financial institutions, we're not going to have economic growth. Transportation networks, canals, roads, railroads, all of that's vital for trade, which we'll come back to on Thursday. Political institutions. We live in a country, I love Inauguration Day. I even love Inauguration Day when I don't like the person who's being inaugurated. Because we live in a country where power is transferred without guns, without bloodshed. It's transferred smoothly and efficiently. I almost missed the oath of office yesterday because it came so quickly. I was in there making coffee, and I had to run out into the living room in order to hear it. That's part of our political institutions, and it means that each administration honors the debts that were incurred, we hope, by the previous administration. Property rights, the nature of our property rights, how we own things and what rights we have to do with the property we own, that influences productivity and influences the pace of economic growth. And the judicial system that enforces those property rights also is an important part of the technology, of the productivity that contributes to economic growth. On Thursday, we'll start with the solo growth model. Have a great day. I'll see you then.